Taiwan versus South Sudan. Levels of development. Brought to you by the United Nations. In order to have a proper understanding of these countries and their connections, we first need to understand their histories. Taiwan is an elongated island state in Eastern Asia. Its modern history began in the 1600s, where it was taken over by the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty maintained control until 1895, where Taiwan was then ceded over to Japan. Japan held Taiwan under strict rule and policy for around 50 years, but in 1945, during World War II, Japan surrendered, and the Republic of China obtained Taiwan. Location-wise, South Sudan is the polar opposite of Taiwan. It's a compacted, landlocked state in the middle of Africa. At the same time, however, South Sudan's history parallels Taiwan. Just like Taiwan, South Sudan has been ruled by foreign powers for hundreds of years. British colonists took advantage of slave traders in that area and separated people of the north and south, creating tension. Then, when the British left Sudan, conflict ensued, with the previously separated people being forced back together. Finally, after many civil wars, South Sudan separated from Sudan in 2011, creating its own state. Now that we've established an understanding of the history of these two countries, we can compare them. The geography of Taiwan is mountainous, surrounded by water, and on a tectonic plate boundary. This is as opposed to South Sudan, which is mostly flat and landlocked. In addition to this, the surrounding water makes trade easier. South Sudan, on the other hand, has a terrain that makes it much harder for foreign trade. Another additional key part of South Sudan is the White Nile, which is all they really have for trade and agriculture. Next is language. When looking at these two countries and their language differences, one of the first things you'll notice is many more diverse languages are present in South Sudan. This could perhaps be attributed to more recent colonial influence, with South Sudan separating from Europe powers much more recently than Taiwan. Religious distribution is another helpful aspect of these two countries that we can use to deepen our understanding of their connections. To start, religious distribution in Taiwan is dominated by Asian religions, particularly China, with a small amount of more worldwide religions like Christian and Muslims. This fact reflects the past rule over Taiwan by China, with little influence from elsewhere. Furthermore, religion never really being a significant cause for conflict in Taiwan reflects how the rule over Taiwan by China and Japan was never influenced by racism or division in the same way the British controlled Sudan. With Sudan, on the other hand, there is a much higher presence of more Western religions in addition to indigenous religions. Another important thing to note is the different impact religion has had on South Sudan, a major cause for conflict over the years. In the present day, South Sudan has a transitional constitution to assist with this issue. However, violence on the basis of religion is still a common threat in South Sudan, even if it's not as prevalent. This violence includes destruction of property, arrests, and even more. Next in this analysis, we'll be covering a few statistics that will further create an understanding of the scale of issues and differences among these countries. First is migration. In Taiwan, immigration versus emigration doesn't lean heavily in one direction or another. With a net migration rate of 1.1 per 1,000 people, immigrants to Taiwan are mostly from less developed countries that are seeking work in industries present in Taiwan. Emigrants, on the other hand, are mostly younger individuals leaving to higher developed countries like the US in search of a higher education. This is actually a recent trend, see the graph, which shows a trend upwards of people leaving Taiwan to enter the US. Compared to other countries in East Asia, Taiwanese immigrants sit towards the top of immigrants towards the US. South Sudan also has many immigrants, but it has a very few immigrants to counterbalance it. In fact, South Sudan is one of the countries with the worst migration crisis in the recent years, with 2.32 million individuals immigrating to neighboring countries and 2.2 million being internally displaced. The major difference between immigration from South Sudan as opposed to Taiwan is what influences the immigration. In South Sudan, immigration is forced through life-threatening conditions such as conflict, food insecurity, and climate change, while immigration from Taiwan is influenced by pull factors from countries with better education, rather than life-threatening dangers. This is a common difference between HDCs and LDCs, with Taiwan and South Sudan being no different. The next important statistic to look at is population. In Taiwan, there are 646 people per kilometer squared, 2,690 people per kilometer squared of arable land, and 58 farmers per kilometer squared of arable land, which is agricultural density. This is one of the first issues that actually comes from Taiwan in this comparison, with agriculture being difficult in Taiwan, with limited farmers and arable land. Furthermore, looking at this population pyramid on the right, you'll notice that it spikes around middle ages and almost curves in at the younger ages, suggesting that Taiwan is at a higher level of democratic transition model, likely around stage 3 or 4. South Sudan's population pyramid shows by far the most people at the base, suggesting they're in a lower stage of the demographic transition model, somewhere around 2 most likely. South Sudan has 20 people per kilometer squared of land, 40.6 people per kilometer squared of arable land, and 38.6 farmers per kilometer squared of arable land. The final statistic we'll focus on is life expectancy, fertility rates, and infant death rates. In Taiwan, the life expectancy is 80 to 81 years. The fertility rate is 0.87, and there are 4.3 infant deaths per 1,000 live births. These three statistics suggest high-quality healthcare and career opportunities for women, as lower fertility rates are generally attributed to women who are prioritizing career over childcare, and the infant death rates and life expectancies can be attributed to high-quality healthcare and potentially things such as food quality and water quality. South Sudan, however, has essentially the polar opposite of all three of these statistics. This suggests poor healthcare, less job opportunities, and poor food and water quality, with a life expectancy of 56 for males and 59 for females, a birth rate of 4.39 children per woman, and 63.8 infant deaths per 1,000 live births. Other qualities that can be impacting these statistics is violence and climate. Compared to other parts of the world, as shown on the graph, South Sudan is incredibly poor when it comes to life expectancy. With those statistics, we can analyze the differences in industry when it comes to these two countries. Once more, starting with Taiwan, while it does have some cash crops grown, like rice, sugarcane, and a few vegetables, Taiwan does not have a very substantial agriculture industry. This can be connected back to earlier when we discussed their population densities. Taiwan doesn't have a whole lot of arable land, and far too many people. Additionally, Taiwan doesn't have many natural resources, which when combined with the previous point, explains why Taiwan relies so heavily on foreign imports. Technology is a much more prevalent industry in Taiwan, helping to produce parts for electronics in tandem with other manufacturing countries. Situation factors influencing these industries are its connection with China, which affects its connection in history with manufacturing, site factors, including the surrounding water, and its close proximity to China and the rest of East Asia, which are important when discussing its position in the supply chain. South Sudan's agriculture scene is much more active. However, it's mostly subsistence farmers supporting life for their families. When it comes to industry, South Sudan is much more involved with its natural resources. In many cases, this would be a trait of an HGC, but in South Sudan's case, it was actually a factor that led to their brutal colonization. The petroleum industry is big in South Sudan, but with situation factors like political opposition with neighboring states and site factors like it being landlocked, it's hard for South Sudan to make it far on this industry alone. The last thing we'll be analyzing in this comparison is the urban areas in these two countries. In Taiwan, the biggest city is Taipei, the capital. The city has many methods of transportation, including the high-speed rail and busing, which is able to cover areas of the neighborhood that aren't usually able to access the metro. Taipei follows a general grid painting pattern, as you can see in the map to the right, and it's best described by the multiple nuclei model. This is because it has many central business districts, such as Xinyi, Dana, Nangang, the Taipei main station area, which I'm not pronouncing correctly. Juba, the capital of South Sudan, is much simpler. It has less options for transport, only really having foot roads and bicycles and scooters in certain parts, and it's best described by this concentric zone model, since as you travel farther from the CBD, the city follows the patterns described in the model. The question you've probably been asking since the start: what caused these differences? Well, for starters, while we were both occupied by foreign nations in the past, South Sudan's occupation came with more violence, exploitation, and general disregard for the future of the nation. In Taiwan, it was more of just land owned by a foreign nation, where people lived and thrived. Economically, South Sudan is also just more restricted in its options. Having so much less access to trade than Taiwan makes it difficult to progress. Lastly, and crucially, South Sudan is so young that it is still working out the issues of a young country, with the added problems that come with recovering from violence and a history of colonialism.